Hi, everyone. Welcome to A Happy Life. I am Dr. Joshua Swift, professor of psychology at Idaho State University, licensed clinical psychologist, and author of Becoming Happy, a guide to self-care and holistic well-being. On today's episode, we are going to talk about the happy hormones, what they are, and how we can use them to our advantage to produce happiness in our lives. But before we get started, let me just remind you to hit subscribe or follow below so you never miss any of our future episodes. And please share with others. Now, when we experience happiness, we can notice changes at several different levels. Changes in our thoughts, our feelings, our facial expressions, our posture, our breathing and heart rates, and even our behavior. Today, in this episode, we are going to focus in and talk about some of the processes that occur within our brains that underlie the experiences or manifestations of happiness that we have. The brain is an amazing organ. In the average adult, it only weighs about 3 pounds and is about the size of 2 clenched fists. But it contains roughly 100 billion main cells or neurons and 1 trillion supporting cells. In comparison, if each of these cells was represented by a person and you packed all of those people together, shoulder to shoulder and front to back, it would fill up the entire country of Spain. Yet all of these cells are condensed into a space roughly half the size of a soccer ball. The brain controls our thoughts, memories, perceptions, desires, temperament, movements, and regulates all of our bodily functions. It even controls our emotions, such as happiness. In a very basic way, the brain is like a relay center. It constantly receives signals from our sensory organs and other parts of our body, interprets those signals, decides what to do about them, and then sends a signal back out to the body telling it how to respond. And all of this is done instantaneously. Back to my earlier comparison, imagine if a person on one side of the packed Spain wanted to communicate something to a person on the other side of the country. It would take days for the message to be relayed from one person to the next until it finally got there. And who knows if this giant game of telephone would even get the correct message to the eventual receiver. But our brain does this instantaneously while still maintaining a very high level of accuracy. So happiness specifically occurs when our brain compares the current incoming messages from our body to past memories and experiences and interprets the current ones as enjoyable and pleasant right now or potentially pleasing in the future. It then sends signals back out to the body, leading to several physiological and behavioral changes. This process, taken together, results in the emotion of happiness. Now, somewhere in this process, the brain also recognizes the happy emotion. It has certain thoughts associated with that emotion, and then the process continues on in an attempt to maintain the happiness over time. The process of sending and receiving the signals is both an electrical one and a chemical one. Within any given cell or neuron, the message moves electrically. So as soon as one end of the neuron picks up the message, it quickly sends an electrical signal down the body of the neuron to the other end, telling it to then pass the message on to the next cell. In this way, it is kind of like flipping on a light switch. Flipping the light switch allows the electricity to pass through the wire to the end where the light bulb is located. But instead of turning on a light, when the electricity passes through the neuron and gets to the end, it signals the release of chemicals. And these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters then travel on to the next neuron, flipping its light switch on and allowing another electrical signal to be sent. And the message continues. Now, certain neurons only respond to certain neurotransmitters. In other words, the light switches are not all the same. They are activated by a certain set of neurotransmitters and not others. So one set can turn on the kitchen lights, while a different set can turn on the garage lights. So when a neurotransmitter is released, it travels through the space between the neurons, and it is just picked up by the ones that it can activate. And in this way, by using specific neurotransmitters and not others, the message gets sent to particular parts of the brain, signaling them to perform their assigned functions. Now, although there are likely over 100 different types of neurotransmitters that are used within our body to send messages to specific neurons or specific cells, really less than a dozen of them play a significant role. With happiness, we see an increase in the release and use of 4 specific neurotransmitters: dopamine, endorphins, oxytocin, and serotonin. So because of this, these 4 neurotransmitters are sometimes referred to as the happy hormones. When these 4 neurotransmitters are released, messages get sent to particular areas of the brain and then body, which result in the mental, emotional, physiological, and behavioral experience of happiness. So let's talk about these 4 happy hormones and how we can hack or activate each one in more detail. The first is dopamine. Dopamine is our reward or feel-good hormone. Its primary job is to reinforce us whenever we do or experience something that is good or that the body likes. If you've ever tried to potty train a child or a pet, you've likely used some type of treat, praise, affection, or fun activity as a reward. And then each time the child or pet went to the bathroom in the right place, you gave them that reward. And over time, out of a desire for the reward, the child or pet learned the right places and times to go to the bathroom. So dopamine is the reward that our brains use to reinforce certain behaviors for us. Whenever we do something that is considered important for survival, eating, drinking, sexual intimacy, the brain releases dopamine, and we feel happy and a sense of satisfaction. Now, not only does the brain release dopamine for the behaviors essential for survival, it releases dopamine for anything that represents a personal accomplishment or achievement for us. So things like getting a good grade, finishing a hard task, or even just feeling pleasure. And this is our brain's way of saying, this is something good, do more of it. Now, fortunately, we can hack this hormone. By doing certain things, we can tell our brains to release more of it, causing us to feel satisfied and happy. Dopamine responds really well to food. High caloric foods in particular send a rush of dopamine throughout our brain. But that rush usually doesn't last very long, and we can become dependent on it. Instead, healthier food choices like fruits, vegetables, and water can signal longer lasting releases of dopamine and happiness. Also thinking about food choices, in our bodies, dopamine is produced from the amino acid tyrosine. Now, this is a non-essential amino acid, meaning that our body can make it on its own. But there are also foods we can eat that are high in tyrosine that may help in the production. These are foods that are also high in protein, like beef, pork, fish, chicken, tofu, cheese, yogurt, nuts, and seeds. In addition to healthy eating, we can cause a spike in dopamine when we accomplish something that we believe is important. So again, getting a good grade, finishing a race, or checking something off of our to-do list. And even just working towards these accomplishments can cause our brain to release that dopamine. Now, unfortunately, there are also unhealthy ways to hack this neurotransmitter. These are things that cause an artificial spike in the dopamine in our brains, which results in an intense experience of pleasure or happiness for a short period of time, but ends up making it more difficult for our brains to naturally produce happiness after the spike is over. These are things like addictive substances and foods, social media, gaming, and pornography addictions, and gambling. They are all artificial and often exaggerated versions of something that naturally brings happiness. So, take for example gambling. In general, it is rewarding to make money. When we make money, we can buy food, clothing, and shelter, which are essential for survival. And so it makes sense that we would experience some reward or an elevation of dopamine when we get a paycheck or open a birthday card with some cash in it. The satisfaction and happiness that we experience is our brain's way of telling us to do more of those same things that resulted in the money. And in these cases, the brain, with its release of dopamine, is kept in check because the money is paired with some level of work. For example, maintaining a job for the paycheck or maintaining a relationship for the birthday card. It is also paired with a schedule, every other week for paychecks or once a year for birthday cards. But with gambling, it's different. Winning an amount of money by chance or luck causes a huge release of dopamine in our brains. This is extremely satisfying and pleasurable, and our brains naturally want more of it. But because the release of dopamine is artificial, there's nothing holding us back from going after it repeatedly. And the random wins that occur, whether they are big or small, continue to cause a big spike in dopamine. But over time, our brains adjust and they become dependent on that behavior for a release of dopamine to occur. And so other things that previously caused a release of dopamine in the brain no longer do. And the brain also doesn't like having the rushes of dopamine all the time. So it tempers them so that the wins from the gambling no longer cause the same happiness that they once did. So all addictions work in the same way. Because our brains come to depend on them for the release of dopamine, it becomes difficult to experience happiness without them. So just to review, dopamine is our reward hormone. It reinforces behaviors by causing satisfaction and happiness when we engage in them. Eating healthy foods, working toward or accomplishing tasks, and avoiding addictive substances and behaviors can result in healthy and happy levels of dopamine in our brains. Next are endorphins. Now, endorphins are the neurotransmitter that causes us to feel euphoria. They work in concert with dopamine to help us feel pleasure. But the pleasure from dopamine is more about satisfaction, and the pleasure from endorphins is more of a high experience that we have. Now, usually when we feel the euphoria from endorphins, the dopamine also kicks in saying, "This is good, do more of it." Endorphins are nicknamed the natural painkiller. And in fact, the name endorphins comes from endogenous, meaning having an internal cause or origin, and morphine, which is a highly addictive narcotic derived from opium that is used to treat pain. Whenever we experience some type of pain in our bodies, our brain then releases endorphins to mask that pain and give us a pleasurable feeling instead. Now, just like there are healthy ways to cause our brains to release dopamine, there are also healthy ways to cause a release of endorphins. And for me, endorphins seem to be a key component to my personal happiness. I love all of the hacks that result in their release. Exercise is probably the best way to signal to our brains to release endorphins. While any exercise will do it to some degree, vigorous exercise is the most effective at triggering this neurotransmitter. This is the exercise that causes your heart to work at 70 to 85% of your maximum heart rate. It is the type of exercise where you would have trouble carrying on a conversation while you're doing it, and you have to occasionally stop to catch your breath. For me, this type of exercise is a miracle cure. My wife and children, they can attest that I'm a happier person when I'm able to get a good workout in the morning. And if I have some aches and pains somewhere in my body, or if I'm stressed from work, a hard run on the treadmill or an intense game of basketball with my boys will make all of that stress go away. Now, it's thought that intense exercise is especially effective for releasing endorphins because of the slight pain that it causes. The pain from our muscles and organs sends signals to our brains, which then release the endorphins to counteract the pain. And this release can cause what is often referred to as, say, a runner's high. Now, I recognize that some people just don't like intense exercise. They do not experience the same highs that others do. Fortunately, there are also other ways to trigger the release of endorphins in our brains. A few different foods will do it. Cocoa is one of them. Now, cocoa plain is pretty bitter, so it's usually mixed with sugar and milk to produce chocolate. And given the higher ratio of cocoa to sugar and milk in dark chocolate, it tends to be more effective than milk chocolate in releasing the endorphins. Now, as I say this, I wouldn't want you to take this as a sign that it's okay to go and eat a whole tub of dark chocolate ice cream every night. And remember that high caloric sugar in the ice cream will cause artificial problems with dopamine that we already talked about. Instead, just a little will do. And this actually reminds me of a tradition that one set of my grandparents had. My grandpa just recently passed away after living to be 100 years old. And he and my grandma had this tradition of eating a single Hershey's Kiss after every dinner. And they both lived long and happy lives. Now, spicy foods are another type of food that increase endorphins. It's thought that spicy foods send pain signals to the brain, which then triggers the production of endorphins in response. And this fact is something that actually was new to me, and I just recently learned it. And on the day that I read about it, I was experiencing some back pain due to pulling a muscle in an earlier workout. So I decided to test it out. And I opened up a bag of Fuego Takis. I'm not sure if you've tried those before, but they're pretty spicy. And I probably ate way more than I needed to. But it did seem to work for my back pain. Now, this could have just been that it gave me a distraction, or it could have been due to the release of endorphins. But whatever the reason, I didn't seem to notice the pain in my back for a while after that. Now, several other behaviors and activities have been shown to stimulate a release of endorphins in the brain as well. Laughing is one of them. This explains why watching a funny show, hearing a good joke, or finding humor in everyday life experiences can cause happiness. In addition, creative activities trigger their production. These activities may include things like painting a picture, composing or playing music, designing a landscape, acting in a play, or writing a script. And finally, direct exposure to the sun can cause the release of endorphins in the skin. I think this is why it physically feels so good to just lay out in the sun sometimes. Just remember to balance this benefit with the increased risk of skin cancer and take proper precautions. Now, unfortunately, just like with dopamine, there are unhealthy and artificial ways to produce endorphins. Self-harm behaviors, such as cutting, are one such thing. When someone cuts or purposely inflicts pain in some way, the brain responds by releasing endorphins to counteract that pain. Now, this type of pain is different from the effects of intense exercise or eating spicy food because it results in actual physical damage to our body, something that our brain tries to fight against. And as a result, similar to what we see with other addictions, our brain makes an adjustment in the way it releases endorphins. It no longer releases this neurotransmitter in response to the activities that it should, and it requires larger and larger amounts of the purposeful pain over time in order to experience the desired effects. So, in the long run, it produces more sadness than it does happiness. Opioids are another example of an artificial and unhealthy imitation of endorphins. Approximately 120,000 people die from opioid overdose each year. And in the United States alone, it's estimated that over 3 million people suffer from opioid use disorder. Now, opioids are a class of drugs that are made from morphine, which is a substance taken from the seed pod of opium poppy plants. They can be directly produced from natural morphine or synthetically made. An illicit version of this drug is heroin, but other versions such as fentanyl, oxycodone, and hydrocodone can be obtained as pain relievers through a prescription. Now, all of these drugs mimic endorphins in our brains. So when we take them, they bind to the same sites that our natural endorphins usually would bind to, and we experience a pain relief effect. Our brains pair this pain relief with a surge of dopamine, and we quickly become addicted. And that is why 60% of those who take opioids for 90 days post surgery are still on them a year later. Now, our brain's response to opioids is artificial. So, since the opioids are doing the job that endorphins would usually do, our brains think that endorphins are no longer needed and they stop producing as much of them. We thus become dependent on the opioids to feel good. In addition, opioids mess with the part of our brain that would usually tell our endorphins to turn off. Those parts of the brains usually are sending signals to turn off the pain relieving and euphoric effects, but the opioids prevent that from happening. So those parts of the brain adjust and they start to become stronger to try to overpower the opioids. And as a result, we get to the point where we can't feel happy without the opioids. And we have to keep increasing the dose to experience the same level of happiness that they used to bring. Now, in general, opioids, even when given by prescription, are a highly addictive drug that has major negative impacts on our long-term happiness. They should be avoided if at all possible, and when necessary, should be used for as short a time as possible in order to reduce the addiction potential. Unfortunately, many doctors do not follow this recommendation when writing prescriptions. And so it is something that patients themselves must pay close attention to on their own. In addition, I do want to recognize that opioid withdrawal can be life-threatening, and those seeking to stop an opioid addiction should do so with the assistance of a medical professional. So, in summary, endorphins are our natural painkillers. Not only do they mask pain, they cause a euphoria or high feeling when they are released. Vigorous exercise, dark chocolate, and spicy foods, as well as laughing and creating music or art, can all cause their release, resulting in a feeling of happiness. And artificial stimulation through self-harm behaviors and opioids should be avoided. Now, third, we have oxytocin. The primary purpose of oxytocin is to stimulate contractions during labor and the production and release of milk for breastfeeding. Now, although the principal function of this neurotransmitter is to aid in the childbirth process, the bodies of biological males also produce this hormone, just at lower levels, about a third of the level of that produced by biological females. In all humans, oxytocin is thought to be the hormone that keeps us together as social beings, helping us build connections, trust, and empathy with others. It helps lead to happiness through a sense of belonging. And for this reason, it's often referred to as the love hormone. Now, our brain usually signals a release of oxytocin in response to wanted touch and social connection. So, healthy ways to hack this hormone include things like giving or receiving a hug, getting a massage, other desired physical touch, and pro social group activities such as volunteering, doing a good deed, giving a compliment, and just listening to someone and expressing empathy. Now, although there has not been much research on unhealthy triggering of oxytocin, artificial behaviors that mimic social relationships have been shown to reduce happiness. Things like social media addictions and pornography addictions sometimes offer an exaggerated and instantaneous imitation of the connection that can occur with real life social relationships. The research on these addictive behaviors have shown an impact on dopamine levels in the brain that can lead to dependence. But the role of oxytocin in this is unclear. So, whatever the underlying mechanism is, whether it's just through dopamine or through dopamine and oxytocin, the research is clear that these types of addictions can have a negative impact on our long term happiness. The last of our happy hormones is serotonin. This neurotransmitter is referred to as the mood stabilizer. Just like our brains signal the release of endorphins in response to pain, it is thought that our brains signal a release of serotonin in response to sadness and depression. This release triggers happiness instead. Now, I mentioned this one last because its role in happiness and depression is actually contended, as serotonin, or the lack thereof, has long been mentioned as one of the key contributors to depression. And SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are the most frequently prescribed antidepressants. These medications work by stopping the neurons in the brain from reabsorbing any unused serotonin. And because it's not reabsorbed, there's more serotonin floating around in the synapses between the cells, ready to be used for the next time a signal needs to be sent. However, research suggests that for mild to moderate depression, SSRIs are actually no more effective than placebos or fake medications. In addition, a recent systematic umbrella review, or a review of several other reviews, suggested that there is no link between depression and low levels of serotonin in the brain. So, the exact role of serotonin in decreasing sadness and producing happiness is not really known. However, serotonin is seen to play a role in other behaviors and activities that do produce happiness. So it may still be a variable that we can hack in our lives. For example, we do know that serotonin plays a role in our wake sleep cycles, which is a strong predictor of happiness. And retina exposure to sunlight has been shown to trigger the release of serotonin in the brain. As we get enough sunlight during the day and the serotonin builds up, it can then be used to create melatonin at night, which triggers our bodies to go to sleep. So, keeping to a regular sleep cycle and getting that sun exposure can help with the serotonin production process. In addition, healthy eating can aid in the production of serotonin. In our bodies, serotonin is produced from tryptophan. However, this is an essential amino acid, meaning that our bodies do not produce it on their own. We have to get tryptophan from the foods we eat. Now, fortunately, there are several good sources of this amino acid. Again, the list is similar to what we saw with dopamine, but things like beef, pork, turkey, chicken, fish, as well as tofu, milk, cheese and eggs, quinoa, and nuts and seeds. Positive thinking and meditation can also aid in our brain's release and use of serotonin. And some research has even shown that gardening can also have a positive effect on this neurotransmitter. When we garden and dig in the soil, we release microbes that are found in the dirt. And inhaling these microbes while engaging in gardening activities has been shown to trigger the release of serotonin. So, in summary, at times when we are unhappy, we tend to retreat in and shore up our defenses against the things that made us sad. We tend to engage in more isolated behavior, and there's a high risk for the use of unhealthy and addictive substances and activities. But this isolation and these unhealthy behaviors actually work against us and lead to a downward spiral of unhappiness. Fortunately, we can use our four happy hormones in healthy ways to break the cycle. We can feel satisfaction and reward by activating dopamine through eating healthy and accomplishing tasks. We can feel euphoria and a high by activating endorphins through physical exercise, sun exposure, eating dark chocolate and spicy foods, laughing, and being creative. We can feel love, connection, and belonging by activating oxytocin through wanted physical touch, group activities, and expressions of empathy. And we can combat the sadness that we all sometimes experience through the activation of serotonin by healthy eating, getting sunlight and proper sleep, thinking positively, meditating, and gardening. Well, thank you for joining us today on A Happy Life. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or follow below to receive notification of all of our future episodes. And please share with others. Take care until next time.